Good morning, Facebook. How are you today? Today is another one of those re-records of the videos from September and August that went up without any volume due to some unknown reason. The volume input seemed to vanish. I guess the good Lord had other plans. I don't know. I'm just rolling with it and being obedient and taking the time to repost them so that the message can actually get through. I saw lots of activity on the post, but not a lot of in-depth watches. Looked like people were just kind of staying with it for a minute or two, which you do have, but was definitely more so than normal. And simply put, that was because beyond the intro with my fair attempt at guitaring the intro to Monster by Skillet, there definitely is... you have to be a lip reader in order to understand what's going on in the message. So this time it will be with audio. And also, when I get the time, I've started trying to figure out the song. But Jeremy Camp and Adriana, his wife, did a project together called the Worship Project. And their chart song, I forget what it's called, I'm sorry, but it's kind of new. But I just love the guitar part, even though it's considerably simpler than the parts that I've been learning from, like, Fireflight or Monster, to that fact. So hopefully I'll get that figured out soon and be able to change that up a little bit to make it a little bit more interesting so you're not hearing the same thing all the time. I wish I were a better guitarist, then I would change it up more frequently, but I just own a lot of equipment and have for many years, but I've never really had the discipline to really take it too seriously. So today's study is called A Lesson for Israel. Yeah, finally getting to it. A Lesson for Israel, a Revelation for Egypt. And the foundation is Exodus 14, chapter 14, verses 1 through 29. As I read through Exodus a few weeks ago, chapter 14, 1 through 29, as my devotions for that morning, I was particularly focused on something I had not typically, I had not really seen, and that being that while the story of victory for the Israelites is the main focus, or at least what typically jumps out there, it is also a story of revelation, for lack of a better word, for the Egyptians. God was not only showing his chosen people that he was their God and would go through great lengths and to redeem them from their bondage of slavery, it seemed he was also showing at the same time what you could view as the early Gentiles, perhaps, that he was the one true God, and made sure the Egyptians knew through this journey of freedom he led his people towards. So as you look through the Old Testament, and as I reflected on, this can see so many other stories. You can see so many other stories where God was at work twofold in the same manner. One for forever bailing out his children, his chosen people, from bondage and hardship they had fallen into, mostly due to their own disobedience. But he almost always, in his word, also demonstrates the opposition, the ones who had them in captivity, that he is the one true God. An example is, think of King Nebuchadnezzar and the fiery furnace. Did he just rescue, did God, when they were tossed into the furnace, did God just rescue Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? No. He also showed King Nebuchadnezzar the presence of whom we believe to be Jesus in the furnace, and through that miracle and the protection of even the fibers of their clothing from the fire, which was turned up, I think, 10 times its normal temperature, he showed the king exactly who he was and who was really in charge. So, I kind of fumbled over a little bit of my words there, because it's not as fresh in my mind since I wrote this several weeks ago. But as God is showing his people, his chosen people, the Israelites, we're all his people, but his chosen people in the Old Testament, the Israelites, that he is their God. And that he is redeeming them, that he is coming to their rescue. And again, a lot of times he's coming to their rescue because they fell in the pit because of disobedience or not listening to him, or questioning him, or participating and partaking in lifestyles that were immoral, orgies, parties, crazy stuff. That God still, in all that, in all their disobedience, not only was setting them free, but whenever he was doing that, it almost seems that he was also implying and making sure that a lesson was given to those who were holding them in bondage, even though a lot of their bondage was because they fell into sin and temptation and wound up getting themselves stuck in the snare. But God is always showing, that he is the King of Kings. So my message to everyone today was the case in Exodus, as was the case in Exodus 14, 1 through 29, and in so many stories of the Bible, is while the world may look bleak right now and outside, outright upside down and horrific things happening, God has not changed and is the same yesterday, today, and forever. So I can assure you, he is on the job, using this time, this generation of people, both believers and non-believers, to again convey his message of being the one true God. And while it may appear otherwise to the non-spiritual eye, he is very much still in control, and he was, as he was from the beginning, and will eternally be. So that is more or less my summary of what I took out of Exodus 14, 1 through 29. So now I'm just going to take a minute real quick, not to drag this on really long, and literally read the scriptures to you, so that you can see the points where God is making himself known to the Egyptians, who I am comparing to being the Gentiles, because they are just like the Romans in Jesus' time. They were not the chosen people. They were the Gentiles, as referred to, and Paul was called to preach to the Gentiles. Exodus 14 verse 1 starts off with, "Then the Lord said to Moses, tell the Israelites to turn back and encamp near Pi Hahiroth." Oh my God. Hiraroth, between Migdal and the sea. They are to encamp by the sea directly opposite Baal Zephon. Pharaoh will think the Israelites are wandering around the land in confusion, hemmed in by the desert. And I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them. But I will gain glory for myself through Pharaoh and all his army, and the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord. So the Israelites did this. So, more or less, the Israelites were set up sort of almost as a sitting duck, you could sort of say, leaving very little, well, actually no room for them to retreat other than back into the arms of their enemies. Now, it's just, I don't know whether it's hours, days, whatever have gone by, that God had softened Pharaoh's heart to where he let the Israelites go. But then, like a puppet, he hardens his heart, and the heart of his people, to say, what are we gonna do? We got no slaves. We gotta go get them. And he changes his mind, and God does all this with the intention of showing him, I am God. So verse 5, taking off there, when the king of Egypt was told, and this is more or less what I just said, that the people had fled, Pharaoh and his officials changed their minds about them and said, what have we done? We have let the Israelites go and lost our lost their services. So he had his chariot made ready and took his army with him. He took 600 of the best chariots, along with other chariots of Egypt. So 600 of the best, but also others. So you can imagine how many people he sent, because of how many chariots he had sent, with officers over all of them. The Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, so that he pursued the Israelites, who were marching out boldly. The Egyptians, all Pharaoh's horses and chariots, horsemen, troops, pursued the Israelites and overlooked them as they camped by the sea near that word that I can't say, opposite Baal-Zephon. As Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians marching after them. They were terrified and cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Now the Israelites, and this is the stuff that God has to deal with, even with us today as children of God. 1 second we're, all right, God, thanks for getting us out of here. And then they get squeezed a little bit, and it's almost like, God, what'd you do? Bring us out here to die? Were there not enough places to bury us in Egypt already? We would have been better off staying there as slaves rather than going through this right now. Didn't we say to you in Egypt, leave us alone, let us serve the Egyptians? So now they're changing their words, because before it was, we're in slavery, we're dying, we're drowning, we're being treated horribly. Now all of a sudden it's like, but we said we wanted to stay. It's kind of like that, and I don't mean to make light of it, but it's almost like that woman who's being abused by her husband, and I know it can be reciprocal, the same case, but it's typically more, the dominant male illustration that we think of when we're thinking of domestic violence. So, that woman being approached by somebody and basically saying, no, no, I slipped, I fell, making excuses, waffling, and then going back to that insanity and that horrible dysfunctional relationship. Well, here the Israelites were ready to throw in the towel because of a little bit of pressure, and they start waffling on their God, saying, why'd you take us away from there? We said we'd rather stay, which is not what they said. So Moses answers the people, do not be afraid. Again, one of the 365 times that the Bible says, do not be afraid. Stand firm and you will see the deliverance of the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today will never see again. Never see again. So the Lord's planning on doing something pretty impressive. The Lord will fight for you. You need only be still. So, there it is. Moses speaking boldly back to the Israelites and saying, stop being afraid. I'm kind of paraphrasing, but he's more or less, in my mind, I'm thinking he's saying, stop being afraid and saying all this stuff that isn't true. God will fight for you. He's got you this far. Why all of a sudden are you backpedaling in fear? But then the Lord said to Moses, why are you crying out to me? So apparently Moses is crying out to the Lord for direction. Tell the Israelites to move on. Raise your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea to divide the water so that the Israelites can go through the sea on dry ground. I can see why Moses had to cry out. Because, unless the Lord had already given him this direction and he was feeling doubtful or not operating in peace so that he could feel the prompting of the Spirit of what he should have been doing, God has to turn around and tell him, to turn around and that he will divide the water so that they can go across clear. And then he will harden the hearts of the Egyptians so that they will go in after them. So he more or less is blinding the Egyptians by hardening their hearts and leading them into their destruction. And I will gain glory through Pharaoh and all his army, through his chariots and his horsemen. The Egyptians will know that I am the Lord when I gain glory through Pharaoh, his horses and chariots. And that's not me, that's the Bible. It repeats itself. Then the angel of God, who had been traveling in front of the Israeli army, the angel of God is leading them, and they're still scared. Can you imagine? I mean, you have a police car leading you in a funeral procession or any special event, or a police escort to the hospital like they used to show for, when a woman is pregnant going to the hospital. You feel pretty well directed. They got the angel of the Lord traveling in front of Israel's army, withdrew and went behind them. So now he's putting himself, the angel of the Lord is putting himself between the Israelites and the Egyptians. So a pillar of cloud also moved from in front and stood between them. Okay, so there's two barriers. So coming between the armies of Egypt and Israel. Throughout the night, the cloud brought darkness to the one side and light to the other side. So neither went near the other all night long. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and all that night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. So this, they show it in the movies like it parted and boom. It says all night long, the wind blew and God. So yes, God used supernatural, miraculous power to do this, but he did it in kind of by putting super to the natural. He used wind to blow the water in such a way over time that it dried it out and pushed the water back. Figuratively, I guess, like walls, because somehow the water wasn't gone, because we know what happens next. Back onto this. So the waters were divided, and the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground with a wall of water on their right and a wall of water on their left. The Egyptians pursued them, and all of Pharaoh's horses and chariots and horsemen followed them into the sea. During the last watch of the night, the Lord looked down from the pillar of fire and the cloud at the Egyptian army and threw it into confusion. So he literally cast down confusion upon the Egyptian army. He jammed the wheels of their chariots so that they couldn't go anywhere. Kind of like, they're stuck in place, so that they had difficulty driving. And the Egyptians said, "Let's get away from the Israelites. The Lord is fighting them against Egypt." The Lord is fighting for them against Egypt. So there's their first acknowledgement, and it was God's plan for them to acknowledge him as God. And right away they're just like, look what's happening. The Lord is fighting for the Israelites, and he's fighting against us. He's not supporting us, he's against us. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea so that the waters may flow back over the Egyptians and their chariots and horsemen." Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at daybreak the sea went back to its place. The Egyptians were fleeing toward the Lord, and the Lord swept them into the sea. The water flowed back and covered the chariots and horsemen, the entire army of Pharaoh that had followed the Israelites into the sea. Not one. And remember, there were 600 of the best chariots, then some others. So we're talking 800, 1,000, 1,200. I don't know what the number is. Not one survived. But the Israelites went through the sea on the dry ground with a wall of water on their right and on their left, as it said earlier. The day the Lord saved Israel from the hands of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians lying dead on the shore. And when the Israelites saw the mighty hand of the Lord is played against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord and put their trust in him and Moses, his servant. But what you also see there, again, and in line with the title of the study, is Egypt's revelation. That God had decided a plan, a course of action that would not just set his people free, but would let their captives know, or their capturers know, that he is the one true God. So I thought that was an interesting angle to come at looking at that scripture, and the message that God doesn't just rescue us from our enemies, but he also he's got rights to brag. Um, you know, we should be giving him the glory, but you can bet your bottom dollar he will make himself known, um, and he has no qualms about it, as he did with the Israelites and setting them free from the Egyptians, and letting the Egyptians know that he was the one true God, just as he let King Nebuchadnezzar know he was the one true God, and so on and so on. So hopefully that made sense. I know it was a little bit rough there today. Got a lot on my mind. All's good, but got a lot on my mind. So just being thankful that I am able to do this, and hopefully in some way share some of the word and a different perspective on things with you than you may hear otherwise. And thank you for following me on Reflections of a Savior. Thank you for dealing with my humanness, which means that I'm not always perfect. And share it with your friends. And again, though you don't seem to be commenting a lot occasionally, please feel free to provide some comments, just even for encouragement, for that matter. Though I do appreciate the video watches and the statistics that I see. If it helps just one person, then it's worth it. But it seems to be helping more than that. So thank you again. Have a blessed day, an awesome weekend, and look forward to seeing you on the next recording.